So this is my workbench, as I was talking about a little bit earlier. And what you can see here is a little bit of narrow gauge stuff. And you can see the south end of Copenhagen Fields, which has been sitting in our house for the last few months. And because it's been sitting in our house for the last few months, we have an awful lot more work done on it than might otherwise be the case. So we've got here the top end of Gasworks Tunnel, and off in the garden would be the King's Cross Goods Yard. So this is York Way, or York Road as it was called, and this is York Road Tube Station. This is the goods warehouse with the potato warehouses here. And the important thing here is that the tube has sort of taken legs, or foundations, shall we say, and is actually going to be modelled in its extent under the layout, as it is up at the north end of the layout at the Caledonian Road. Now, a lot of the work that's gone on with this is a basis of getting more and more information as the model progressed. So that's one thing, because as I say, this phone might die, so I don't really want to turn it on and off too much. This is something, as I say, completely different. And this is this is the engine shed at Linton on the Linton and Barnstable Railway. And what we have here is a Linton and Barnstable locomotive, which started off as a Helljan Linton and Barnstable locomotive. So this little engine, I can just okay. This runs on paper. All right. So what we have here is a battery-powered engine, and I'll go through that in a little bit. And you can see the mechanism for it there, which obviously is a scratch-built mechanism, but we're using the Helljan bodywork and so on for the bulk of the engine. The dome is a scratch-built, properly built dome, because the painted brass doesn't work very well. And that's going to go on this little layout, except this little layout actually will be quite large by the time it's finished. I won't, it's difficult to get on the track being narrow gauge. The important thing here is that it's not 009, it's 008, if you want to call it such a horrible name. It's 4mm scale, 2-foot gauge. So it actually has the track is 40 thou 2mm association flat bottom rail soldered direct to sleepers. In fact, Keith Arms has made the turnouts for me because he's much better at it than I am. But that's another little project, and that sort of started in the early stages of lockdown, in actual fact. And it's something I've been fiddling with for quite a long time, off and on over the last few years. And this kit is made out of a cardboard kit. So that's enough of the phone. Let's go back to some images and we can talk through those things then, okay? So, excuse me a moment or two. What would you like first? Would you like the tube or the Linton and Barnstable first?
I think the Linton and Barnstable is still in people's brain, isn't it?
Yep. Okay. Where the hell is it?
I'm sorry.
Okay. Here we go. Here we go. Right. All right. So the actual Linton and Barnstable is actually one of the prettiest parts of the country by a long way, and this is the terminus at Linton, which was about a mile from the actual town, half a mile in good railway fashion. And this is a tinted postcard, and you've got Wales opposite there, where it's been brushed out in this tinted postcard. But it's a railway, of course, that closed in 1935.
Are you sharing, Tim?
Oh, sorry. Should have been.
We can't see anything apart from your lovely face.
Oh, right. Well, that should be enough. Hang on. That should be right now. Is that right?
Yes, that's good.
Great, good stuff. So, yeah, Linton Terminus. It was a narrow gauge railway, which was actually built to quite standard gauge standards, if you like, in terms of the infrastructure and everything else. So it's quite a proper railway, and it's one I've always had a sort of soft spot for. And so I thought, yeah, we'd visit there. And of course, it exists in embryo now. It's being remade. A very nice group of people doing that. And so I thought, let's see what we can do with this. So sort of started to look around on it. And of course, there is quite a lot of stuff available in 009 for it, from Pico and Heljan and people like that. But there's a company in Australia who actually made some laser cut kits, printed paper kits, for the whole load of buildings at Linton itself. So these are made by a company called Outback Models, and they're quite well done. They're quite well done, but the printing isn't too brilliant, but it's that's a pretty cruel photograph of it. But the laser cutting makes things very good. But oftentimes with stuff that's sort of pushing a technology, it comes out a bit thick. So for instance, here what I'm doing is thinning down the window cardboard so it's less thick, so it doesn't look like it's got UPVC glazing, it's just got wooden glazing kind of thing. And so you can see that in situ on there, so it's much thinner on the inside, and there you see the outside of it. On the engine shed here. So this was a first trial really to see what I could do with it as a project. So the brickwork is there, but to be accurate, it needs to have an arch above the lintel there in terms of what was at Linton. There is a book out there called Linton Barnstaple Design and Drawn or something like that, which has everything in it. So that's just painting in the stones. And those are a perfect match, those stones, for the railway weathering colours made by, come on, Mick, you know who makes the railway weathering colours?
Life colour.
Life Colour, yeah. They're railway colours with track, red oxide, greys, browns, and so on, work very well for matching up to this. So there you see the building taking some shape, scribed ends. The building is accurate at one end. It's all card, which I don't normally use, but it's a nice feel to it, card. It gives a softness to a building, which is quite hard to get in 2mm scale, with plastic card sometimes, especially I think in the bigger scales. So taking quite a bit of care to try and get the stonework to match up, and then also to give it a bit of 3D texture. So this is for instance, the corrugated roof. And what I'm doing here is scoring it along the corrugations with a ball-ended burnisher, pear-shaped burnisher, actually, to be technically correct, to give it a little bit of three-dimensional shape. And there you see the building beginning to sort of come together. And a lot of the stones were retouched and redone because these are a little bit like wallpaper. And once your eye sees the pattern, it doesn't unsee the pattern. So quite a lot of this was actually repainted. But it's a good starting point for the little model. The actual engine shed had 2 inspection pits in it, and I thought, get those underway. I thought this would make a nice little diorama to start with. So it's all made out of card and PCB for the track, of course, and set into place so there's no joints. I hate joints under buildings. If you can avoid it, it's really a good idea. And so the roof was removable at this stage of the proceedings. That's ratio guttering, but cut down a fair bit. And one of the other things I thought would be nice to do would be to make a puddle. So that's the card, just scraped back a bit, repainted where it's been scarred. And then that was filled in with epoxy resin, araldite or similar, 5-minute job. And then a cover glass. Can you see there? There's a piece of glass been laid over the top of that. Because one of the problems when you do these things with varnishes or similar is that they're not flat, they're not reflective, and it's not right. So putting that down, gives us a dead flat surface to the puddle. And the idea was that that would come off. Well, it didn't. It stayed put, and it stayed put fairly well, but it does easily break away because these cover slips are only 0.17 millimeters thick, so they chip away quite well. And then what I did was to remake the edges and to cover in the edges. So this is a sort of pre-colored polyfiller mix and ash and glue and so on. And I put some PVA over the top of the glass with a bit of paper in it to stop it from getting any stains or marks on it particularly. So that could then be peeled off. And then you've got your puddles. So that gives you a really flat reflective surface. And a lot of people, when they see it, put their finger on it to check if it's wet or not, which is quite nice. And then you can see all the ash and all the rest, which is genuine ash out of a traction engine, actually. But it's yeah, quite a fun little exercise.
Tim, why not just leave the little glass plate in place and
well,
around it? I think other people have done that way.
I thought it would peel off. Because I thought the glue wouldn't bond to it that well. And so I started to remove it. So once you start to remove it, effectively, you've got to finish removing it, so to speak, really. So yeah, if it had come off, I'd have been happy, but it didn't. And yes, you could have left it there. But equally, you're going to get a better bond of the material to the cardboard around it than not. One of the things I think actually when people make puddles and rivers and streams and things like that is that they often put in their resin, which is great. I mean, this isn't resin, but not really anyway. But what they do is then leave it and they don't paint in the edges, and they have this horrible meniscus, and water in scale doesn't climb up walls. It doesn't have this great big curved meniscus on the edges. So you know, whenever I've done water in the past on Chiltern Green, Luton Hoo, my original N-gauge layout even, I've always made it bigger than it needs to be and then grow the edges over the river or whatever it is a little bit so that you don't have that horrible meniscus on the thing. So you can see the reflection there. I'm quite happy with an awful lot of work for a piffling amount of ground cover, but hey, that's what it's all about, isn't it, really? But
Tim, can I just ask you again, when you said about, did you say the stuff you put in the puddle was araldite? Did you just say?
Araldite, yes, it was clear, you know, 5-minute epoxy for the actual water. You could have just left the glass, but that is
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah,
it's very fragile. And if you
and the other thing is, you said that about the PVA. That was just simply so that you didn't spoil the surface whilst doing the rest of the scenery.
Yes, it acted as a protective layer. You could have put masking tape on or something like that, perhaps, but it just enabled it to be protected a little bit while I was working on it.
Thank you.
It's awfully fiddly for not a lot, but it's worth it, I think, in the end. Now, there's an awful lot of information on the Linton Advanced out there, massive amounts, and really good books. And of course, there were a lot of steel signs, as ever, on the old railways. So what I've done is make up artwork from online sources and so on, and make copies of the actual signs that adorn the station. And you can do an awful lot of touching in and repainting and so on. There's good software out there, nothing very clever. But oftentimes what I will do is use PowerPoint, because actually it's got quite a lot of flexibility in resizing images and joining up images and things like that. And so that's often what I'll do, and then print off a PowerPoint slide. And then that gives you the signs. And those are always printed on paper, thin paper, not thick paper, and taking care to make sure the edges are right, obviously. You don't need shiny surfaces in any small model railway scale. I think it's best not to go too shiny. So, you know, people who use photographic high shine things, I think it's too bright to the eye. And a lot of it comes down to your eye seeing the colors that you want to see. And it's best to be a subdued palette, not a garish palette. However, these little signs do bring it to life really rather well. And there are photographs showing them stacked in the entrance to the engine shed. So I did that. I couldn't miss out on a Watson's mattress cleanser there. But you see the windows come out fairly dirty and miserable, but that's what they were, of course. It's an engine shed, it's not a house. And that's the other end. And that's some of the Model U stuff with the battered cans, oil drum, jack, and so on. And there's some wonderful paints out there for doing rusty things. And I'm sure Mr. Bonwick can talk about that forever and a day. But there are some really good techniques out there that you can use, and they do bring the model to life. But the other thing is that you see models oftentimes, and people put things on their layout rather than having them on the layout. And I don't know if that's a good use of English, but what I do with these sort of things is I'll scrape away the earth, the ground cover, so that they sit in or on the earth, not perched on a lump of debris. And models often show their models because they don't have the things sitting down tight to the ground. And these would be unliftable by a person if they were full, you know, they're heavy. So they're going to sink into the ground. And so, you know, getting that finish where it's right in the ground, I think is really important for a lot of modeling. And buildings in particular should not have gaps around the edges. And it's jolly hard to avoid it, but it can be done. So this is the other end of the engine shed. And this is some stuff I got. There's some nice etches out there, some nice laser cut stuff. And so this actually was started off as a laser cut kit. These are etch tools from, a chap who makes lots of etch tools and greenhouses and things like that.
Seven models, is it?
That's the one. Yep, that's it. And this is actually a sort of looking back at my youth. This is because my father was a farmer, and he had a workshop where he made a lot of stuff, massive amount of stuff. He was a real engineer, really, in truth. And he had a blacksmith's vice, vice off the ground. And I'd love the number of times as a kid I caught my hand in that bloody Tommy bar on the vice there, just where they drop down and pinch the inside of your thumb and your forefinger. So that had to be done. So that's the vice in the workshop in the engine shed and so on. And that's an overview of it. And that's going to be the view that the public don't see, because most people model Linton looking at it from the roadside, whereas I'm going to model it looking at it from this side. Like, whoopsie. So that's the engine shed. And what will happen is the model boundary will follow the railway boundary just inside it or wherever, all the way along. It's about 12 to 14 feet long, I think, all up in 4mm scale, and it will be dead scale. And the ultimate layout will be about 18 inches wide in this bit here, 2 foot at most. And then there'll be a massive extension, not massive, but it will look massive, taking the model into the Lynn Valley and over the hills to Exmoor and so on, with very much reducing scale. So it will be a pretty big scenic diorama when it's finished, although it will look bigger than it is in reality. So that's a long-term project that's sort of simmering away on the back burner at the moment. Okay, so any questions on that? And it will be scale, you know, as in not 009, it'll be proper at 8mm gauge. Okay.
The signs that you've got there, Tim, did you have to reshape them from photographs, or where did you manage to find the sort of material that was flat on, so you didn't have to deal with?
You can get it. If you hunt around, you can generally find an image somewhere. There's a massive amount there on Mr. Google. So you just look for the ones that are clean and tidy. I mean, this Whitbread's, whoopsie, stout sign was very rusty and seriously degraded. So I put it into a program and touched in all the white and repainted the white, and you know, if you zoom in on it, you can see where it's done. But of course, at scale, it totally disappears. So you've got a bit of a touch-up job, but it's not too difficult to do, and there are packages out there that you can use to make it work. Okay. All right. Any other questions on that? Great. So the engine that's going to drive it, or one of them anyway, obviously has to be made to work to the new standards. And so it's essentially, let's have a look at the difference here. So this is the set of wheels and so on from the Helgen loco, and the valve gear on the Helgen locos is very much their Achilles heel. It's too floppy. It's had lots of problems, lots of reliability issues and so on. But you know, the mechanism is quite good, but you know, the more I looked at it, the more I thought, well, I've got to do something completely scratch built. So that's what we've got here. So this is making the axles for the new chassis with proper shouldered surface there. Then this is a strip of steel that's been drilled. I've got a very, very, very nice precision drill. So that's, any idea what that lot's going to turn into? Any offers?
A jig?
No.
I
Any
assume it's
offers?
going to be cranks.
Yeah, yeah. So often, you know, you can, if you've got a drill that you can just wind in the numbers, you can just jig drill, well, not jig drill, but use it by dead reckoning to drill all those holes. That's fine. And with modern tungsten carbide drills, that makes life so much easier than it used to be. Then you chop them out, and then you put them in the vise and start to file them up. So what you can see here is I'm using a couple of drills to hold them true. So a small drill for the pin, big drill for the axle, and you put a couple of obviously scalpel blades there, and then a jolly big file to file down and to get them to shape. So again, you can see them being held by the drills in the vise, and it's a watchmaker's vise. Obviously, it's a Bergeon, but there are Chinese knockoffs which are just as good. Well, they're not as good, but they're good enough. And that's the cranks and a spare one under there as well. Always make a spare. And there you see them going onto the axle so that they're designed to fit onto the shoulder there and be chunky, because they are chunky. They're very big bits of metal on these engines. So then you look at the chassis itself and you think, well, it's not going to work. So I bit the bullet and made a new set of frames, but elected to use the rear end of the original frames and the front end of the running plate and so on. And to integrate it with the body meant you had to integrate it with the fixings. It's an awfully complicated mechanism in the Helgen thing, in fact. So that's sighting rods for the frames. And what you can see straight away is that it's broad gauge relatively, going back to earlier comments, and it's using the outside frames. Those are spacers there, brass spacers. And the wheels are obviously going to go in the middle. This is machining up the coupling rods and cutting those out. I don't think I'll spend too much time on that unless somebody wants to desperately find out how to make coupling rods.
Jim, is the thickness of the frame actually scale, or is it over thick?
It's over thick, but it's the thickness of the bearings.
I meant from a scale point of view.
Actually,
it would be.
It's the thickness of the bearings of the real thing.
Oh, right.
Yep. So it's thicker inside than it should be, but you've got more than enough space to accommodate that because of the narrow gauge and all the rest of it. And also don't forget your 8mm gauge. So your gauge is narrower than end gauge. Well, that's a statement of the obvious, isn't it, really? So putting inside frames, inside bearings, you're making life jolly hard for yourself because you've got, any errors are going to get exaggerated really quite massively. Your engine will waddle and do all sorts of nasty things. So, it's thick brass because that's going to be the bearings, and the thickness of the frames isn't visible, or it's scarcely visible. Certainly not from a normal viewing angle.
So I had one question, Tim. That was when I've read about scratch building locomotives in the past, the method seems to always be suggested to build the coupling rods first and then use those to mark out the bearings. I see you've done it in reverse. Is that just because modern production means that accuracies can be applied equally, or is there some other reason?
They're absolutely 1000% right. And up until 2 years ago, I would have done it that way, as you say. But I now have an incredibly accurate mill drill, watchmaker's mill drill, which is made by a chap called John Stevens. He makes gear for watchmakers. And I can dial in the dimensions and it will come out dead right. And it works. So I don't need to do the two together. But you're absolutely right. Historically, you would use one as a drilling jig for the other. You know, when I made Lord President, or Mons Meg as it turned into the 282, that's the way I did it then, because that was the only way I could do it with the drills and things I had. Whereas now, with the modern mill drill I've got, I can do it direct by dead reckoning, and it does work. The other thing that's important is that you need to go over to tungsten carbide drills, because they self-center better, they run truer, and they're much, much better than the drill sets that you buy at shows, shall we say. But you've got to have a very high-speed drill press to make them work, but they do work much nicer than the, you know, those racks of drills that you buy and so on, yeah? So that's, yeah, you're absolutely right, absolutely right. Now, with this, I do want to be able to drop the...
Tim, sorry if I'm butting. Where do you get the tungsten carbide drills?
Sources.
Is it from the conventional engineers, suppliers?
Look online. There are companies that supply them. I can find a... I can give Mick an address for a company source that I use. Cousins, as I mentioned earlier, I think they probably sell them. They're very common now because they're all used in the modern production techniques, you know, PCBs and all that business. So they're very, very common now. So yeah, they're available. Now with this engine, contrary to what I said about the 2 mil engines, this one needs to be able to be dismantled in order to make it. And so what I've done here is to split the axle boxes and make a keep for the bottom, which actually doubles up visually as the brake rigging. And there you see it in situ in the frames. And these are the plastic frames, which are sort of being scarfed into and added on to this. So this is the brake rigging on the chassis here, okay? And this milled out is to give more clearance and also to represent how the real thing is a little bit. So that's the chassis there with the coupling rods in place, with it put up into the big old block there. Now for this engine, it's got a gearbox on it, which is 17:1, I think, or 19:1, something like that. It's from Exacta scale originally, or CNL Exacta scale. It was a 4 mil availability anyway. And the motor gearbox on here is a Maxon motor, a 6-volt motor with a 1:4 gearbox on it. So that's for...
You've muted yourself, Tim. We can't hear you, Tim.
All right, yeah, my flailing mouse hit it. Anyway, that's for setup, and you can see beautifully the meshing of the gears and all the rest of it. So that needed a bit of tweaking to get it down to size, but not much. And that needed to be to be engineered a bit to fit onto the end of the motor there and so on. Hang on, what's gone wrong here? It just gets a bit bunged up on itself sometimes. Oopsie, so here you go. So this is the mechanism at work with the motor sitting between the wheels. It's only a very small diameter motor. And of course, the beauty of this is it's not split frame, it's solid, because it's not going to pick up track current, it's a battery engine. go from there. Okay. So it came about, actually, there was an article in 2mm magazine where somebody had fitted a battery and remote control to a 2mm Ginty, Parish Ginty or whatever. And I thought, well, that sounds promising. So I thought, let's see what we can do with this. So this is the setup for a battery powered engine with it all flapping around in the breeze. One battery, one receiver, one on off switch, one plug and socket for the charger to charge the battery, one plug and socket to disconnect the motor from the battery, which is useful. Oopsie. So that's the setup, sitting on in the chassis, in the body, and in the steel block, or big lead block rather. And so it's all sitting down quite snugly, and you've got a vast amount of space in these engines to do other things. So the bodywork was massively milled out to take the biggest battery I could get into the tanks. And the receiver was, again, the back end of the firebox was milled out to take the receiver, which is very small. And you can see the wiring coming off the receiver. And what you can see here is the socket for charging it. And here you can see the little tiddly switch for turning it on and off. And that's necessary because if you leave it on, it will flatten the battery because the receiver is always working, even if it's not doing anything. So those need to be accessible for charging and for turning on and off. And that's a really pretty miserable looking piece of modeling. But the reality is it's the wiring and it's the receiver put on a jaunty angle. Whoopsie, there we go. Put on a jaunty angle and then embedded in araldite, okay? So this is all embedded in araldite, so basically to freeze it in position. And it's actually poking through into the cab a little bit. And that's because the receiver has a telltale to tell you that it's on. And so if you have that, let me see if I can get the phone to work here. Can you get the put it on the phone, Mick? Is that possible? Change me over if I stop sharing here. Okay, is that showing? Mick's gone to sleep, I think. Anyway, let's go back to sharing.
You can pin that if you wanted to.
Let's not worry about it, John.
Okay.
Anyway,
It's done now, Tim.
too late, she cried. No problem. So the little light that's on the chip. Oh, here you go. That's actually okay. Okay, back on the phone then. In that case, just briefly, if that's possible.
You'll need to stop sharing your screen,
Yeah,
Tim.
I'm just going to do that. Yeah. So can you see the flashing light? Whoop. The phone has just died, as I said it would. Never mind. Let's not try and be too clever here. Back to the share screen then, Mick.
Yeah.
There we go. So the little flashing light basically, or the light gives a firebox glow, and you need to know that because you need to know that it's working. And that tells you what the state of the engine is and so on. So that's setting it up. That's the battery filling completely the tanks. So I got the biggest I possibly can, and that should give a few hours of running. That's milling out the battery. And then we come to things like the chimney, which had a horrible painted chimney. There's a removable piece. And I thought, oh, that's a bit strange. And underneath it was a brass turning. So why the devil did they paint the blooming thing? So I just cleaned the paint off and that's your brass chimney. Now the dome was pretty horrid. So I turned up a new brass dome. And then the problem was, how do you make it fit the boiler? So I turned up a new bit of boiler and fitted that in. And that's the dome ready to be fitted onto the boiler. And you can see again the shoulders as we had when we did the B3, the 9P 460. And then these are the sort of burrs and things I use for bringing it down to shape. So a tungsten carbide cutter and then abrasive wheels of varying degrees of abrasivity. And that's the battery in place, and there's the receiver and all the rest of it. And that's the little engine sitting, simmering, waiting for the rest of the layout to get built. And all of the valve gear, which is going to be fun because it's joy valve gear, and that's going to be hugely entertaining to make. So I'm quite looking forward to that, but I need to, yeah, that'll be another story, I suspect. All right. Any questions on that?
Yeah, Tim, I noticed you use quite thick wire for the electrical connections.
It's what comes with it.
Did you experiment with using thinner wire because it would have been easier? Or yeah, was there a reason why you used that wire? Was it just the wire it came with rather than anything else?
It's the wire it comes with, and that's your problem, John. You're stuck with it, literally. So yeah, I've got thinner wire, and it's just an issue. It's a small model, don't forget. So you are struggling a bit on that, but it's just clunky stuff, and you can't. Well, you don't want too many joints in it. Every joint is a problem, is a potential.
No, you'd have to probably try and solder it off of the receiver, which
yeah,
would not be everybody's cup of tea. The other thing is the antennae for the radio receiver.
Yes.
What do you connect that to, or did you? How did you?
It's the slaking pipe in the cab.
Oh, okay.
So it's sticking out where that little light goes is where the receiver. So it's knocking around inside the cab. And obviously the engine is going to get a lot more detailing on it yet and so on, but because whilst it's a lovely model, it can still be made better, obviously, of course. So yeah. All right.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yes, please, Tim. With regards to the battery,
Yeah.
is it easy to replace the battery, or is it quite a major disassembly job? Or
I can dismantle the engine reasonably easily, so the battery can be easily enough replaced. So it's not a big deal.
So from an exhibition perspective, for instance, would you be able to swap the batteries over rather than one charge?
No, you'd recharge through the charging socket. So not on an engine like this. It's so fiddly. You can't just take the body off and plug a new battery in. It's that's not going to happen anytime soon. Not once it's got all the valve gear on it either. You know.
So from that side of things, and how long? Roughly, do you know how long it would take to charge?
I don't really. Oh, to charge, I haven't really played it hard, and I don't know how long it would last under exhibition conditions. Quite a long time, I suspect, because you're only tiddling around on a layout with this. If you had it running continuously, that might be a different story, but I think it would last probably most of a day, because it is a big battery relatively. And you're going to ask me what size battery it is, and I can't remember, so you can't get that answer. But
No, it's the size that fits the tender. That's the tank. That's the answer.
Yes, I did start off with a smaller battery. I did start off with a smaller battery, and I thought, well, actually, there is more room here than I'm using, and I've got, obviously, I'm going to have to make 2 or 3 engines all up, and so the next one will go straight in there, mill the guts out of it, and away you go. I mean, haulage-wise, it's more than powerful enough for what it's going to do on this little layout, because it's just tiddling around. I'm thinking of doing it for 2 mil as well, because on Copenhagen Fields in the goods yard, we've got a goods yard which could be shunted, and the beauty of a battery-powered engine is dirty track. Doesn't matter. You've got a much simpler system, albeit you make complexity in another area. And so I've got a J52 or J13, a Great Northern 060 tank, and that's worn out. And it's got plastic insulated wheels on it. It's made by a chap called Neil Ballantyne originally. And the intention on that will be to mill out a solid brass chassis, put those wheels in, use one of these small motor drives, battery in the tank, receiver in the wherever, on-off switch and thingy in the bunker, and job's a good one. But yeah, I've got to make it yet. But it's having done this little engine, it's yeah, I can see how you have to simplify things and how you set out the wiring and so on. There's a huge amount of information out there on this business. Huge.
It's all really very interesting. So to wind up on that, and not to take up anybody else's time, what sort of the rough costs is it for installing the equipment?
It's quite cheap, really. I mean, all up, I think an engine is about 20 quid, say, something like that, with the receiver and the battery and the sockets and so on. So it's not expensive relative to the DCC, say, which you'd be paying, you know, for chips and things. So I think it's about comparable, actually, frankly. The company I get it from is Micron Control, and they've got a whole load of stuff. And yeah, you know, look at their website, and they say they have it's a bit of a clunky sort of electric nerdy type of website, if you know what I mean. But you can work your way around it, and the chappie is very helpful if you speak to him about it and so on. So yeah, useful stuff.
Thank you. That's really, really thought-provoking, that is.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other questions on that, Tor? No? Okay.